The chair now recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank everyone for being here. As discussed today, the Clean Futures Act aims to massively build out electricity transmission to transform the economy towards complete electrification. I'm not anti-EV, but I am opposed to federal mandates requiring electric vehicles. Also have concerns about the rush to green in the U.S. transportation sector and the implications that this will have for the grid, energy rates, and reliability. Also believe there's a huge disconnect between those who live in metropolitan areas and those areas in rural America. I was interested to hear a brief glimpse of these issues from Congresswoman Schreier just now. I will point out that I've been told each charging station has a cost of around $70,000. That's not counting the build-out infrastructure needed to get electricity to many of those areas. From an environmental justice perspective, I do find it ironic that the reality of the Democrats' EV plan may result in the cost of charging stations being passed along to utility customers, many of those in low-income communities. EV tax credits are regressive and burden working-class Americans and many who don't own nor have intention to purchase electric vehicles. According to the Congressional Research Service, about 78% of the credits claimed are by filers with an adjusted gross income of more than $100,000. Putting aside the climate motives behind the electric vehicle push, the policy on its face is a transfer of wealth scheme, harming folks like my constituents. If you live in rural South Carolina and you do not own an EV, you are de facto subsidizing some wealthy person's purchase of one. Furthermore, most of my constituents don't want EVs. According to the Auto Alliance, almost 50% of my constituents that own a vehicle drive either SUVs, pickup trucks, or minivans. Many of the jobs and lifestyles my constituents have require them to drive pickup trucks and bigger vehicles. I know auto companies are investing in larger electric vehicles, but the reality is the technology is just not there. So, Mr. Scarcardi, it's clear the bureaucrats here in Washington and the Biden administration are pushing a one-size-fits-all approach to EV policy. They want an irreversible path to EVs and do not care about the lack of consumer demand. Do you think policies like the Clean Futures Act totally ignore market realities and consumer demand? What's the right approach, Mr. Scarcardi?
We believe the right approach is focusing on outcomes. In this case, if the outcome desired is to reduce carbon intensity and reduce emissions, there are ways to do that in a way that's market neutral and technology neutral, that will bring fuels to market that will continue to reduce the carbon intensity of fuels. As I mentioned earlier, we believe that this can happen and has happened. It's happened in the liquid fuel space with the renewable fuel standard that was passed by this Congress almost a decade ago. We have brought down the carbon intensity of liquid fuels. There's still a lot more work to be done there. And I think EVs are absolutely a part of the future. But I think the key is we have the opportunity to allow technology to compete, because ultimately it has to be consumer focused. Consumer wins when all technologies are competing and they have many options for the lowest possible price. And that's what we think is important, is focusing on outcomes and allow the consumer to have a choice and allow the consumer to have a lot of competition to get the lowest possible prices.
Look, I talked to a lot of my petroleum marketing companies, and many of them do agree with you that EVs are part of the future. In fact, they would like to have charging stations because as that consumer is sitting there for 15, 20, 30 minutes charging an EV, they're probably going in the convenience store and purchasing a lot of the items in that store where the margin is much higher than the gasoline sold by those petroleum marketers at the pump. I want to shift gears. Dr. Fosh, you state in your testimony, data is in a fragile state. Could you walk through some of the data and intellectual property concerns related to EVs that you have identified?
Sure. Just quickly, in a nutshell, it's everything from the design of batteries, the chemistries, powertrains, manufacturing processes, the design and intellectual property associated with a lot of the electric power system equipment, design and intellectual property associated with advanced mineral processing. It's a pretty big list. Would you like me to continue? I think I've given you enough of a flavor.
You've done great, and I appreciate that. I'm about out of time, so Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back the 8 seconds I've got. Thanks.